Hello, beautiful people. My name is Anthony, and I am a dungeon master for a D&D group on Wednesdays. And I've been watching a lot of Matt Colville's videos recently, the last few months or so. And he used to run a campaign diary on his page, and last night we had such an excellent D&D session that it sort of inspired me to want to make my own campaign diary. I'll put a link to Matt's channel down in the description below. My session last night, which was Wednesday night, was so intense and awesome, and everybody was really focused and in tune, and it really inspired me to want to start doing these myself. My friend Mark, one of my players, he records most sessions, but it's mostly for the sake of going back to get information that may have gotten lost in translation or something that I forgot to write down in my own notes that I had to make up on the spot, something like that. The group dynamic is such that right now I have 4 consistent players, 3 of which have been playing characters that they've been playing since the very beginning of the campaign, which is about 33 sessions now. We run the game every week. We're quickly approaching our 1-year marker. Hopefully we can keep things going. And I was so enthused after last night's session. I was riding so high off of the experience that I really wanted to start making these mostly for my own, personal enjoyment, but also I know that a lot of DMs get inspiration and people like hearing about other groups. I do anyways. And so I thought maybe it would be a good contribution, we'll call it. I thought maybe it might be a good contribution to the Dungeons and Dragons community as a whole. Hopefully you find or hear some things in here that inspire you to DM or maybe be a player or pick up D&D. It's just really good storytelling in my opinion, and it's an enjoyable experience to hang out with friends. As such, I suppose I should get started with the character introductions. Right now, I have 4 players, and 3 of them are playing characters they've been playing for a long time, and I'll introduce them first and the most recent addition afterwards. Our first character is played by my friend Dan. His character's name is Runan Lasso. He's a human fighter, and he's generally a good guy, but he sometimes crosses the line a little bit. His character's backstory was that he was a member of the city guard in this huge capital city where the campaign takes place called Solara. And he was a member of the city guard in this big city, and he was dishonorably discharged because he was covering for a friend that he ran into who was stealing food and medicine to support his son, who he couldn't support on his own. He was kind of like a layabout, drunken after he, I believe he suffered an injury, and then he became kind of like an alcoholic and was unable to really provide for his son in any meaningful way. And so Dan's character, Runan, caught him stealing, and he decided to give him a pass, but his supervising officer, his captain or some such, caught the thief, his friend Jorah, and executed him on the spot. He rode him down on a horse and killed him. And this officer's name is Rhys Alaran, and he is a half-elf bastard from an elven noble family that's pretty well respected in the city. And so after that, Runan was ejected from the Watch for a failure to do his duties, and it was kind of a sham. There's a tribunal process, and because of the fact that Rhys is a son, despite being a bastard, he's a son of a nobleman, he carries a lot of clout, and he basically had Runan ejected. And even though it was a just ejection, Runan harbors a lot of resentment towards that family and that person in particular, and generally he thinks the rule of law is kind of a sham because it can be bought out by the nobility. As such, he sort of went his own way for a while. He floated around, and because finding honest work was really tough for him. Everybody who's a member of the Watch is tattooed, and having been ejected dishonorably, that tattoo is burn scarred off of your body. And that's a really big thing in this city is like a sign of respect is having those tattoos, regardless of if it's for military service or being in the city watch. There's different tattoos for a lot of different things, a lot of different markings and stuff. But he kind of had a lot of mistrust placed upon him in the public eye, except for around the area where he spent most of his time on guard, because he was actually a pretty fair and just city guard. And so he ended up falling in with a group of ne'er-do-wells called the Grey Cloaks. They were generally unlawful folk, but they really crested that line. They were very much a gray area sort of organization. They weren't a formal guild, but they were a group of collaborating highwaymen, basically, who went through the city and they took money from merchants who sold shoddy goods and swindled people to basically prevent those people from getting a refund. And, they would beat people down in the street and keep them away from the merchants that hired them. And it was very much like a shady sort of business. And over time, Runan wanted to try to help the son of his friend who was killed, but his son Austin wouldn't have anything to do with him and basically shunned him. And so in secret, he funneled money towards this young man to try to go to a wizarding school in the city. And he did, indeed, he did get into a wizarding school, and life was generally pretty mediocre for Runan past that point. And he spent a fair bit of time, I think he's in like his mid-40s at this point. He spent a fair bit of time working with the Grey Cloaks until eventually, when the campaign started, the former leader of the Grey Cloaks, Gideon Rodai, he left. Basically, he up and left, being taken by a paladin and of the Order of Fate, and for some greater purpose as yet undiscovered, and left Runan holding the bag for all of these people who he was now responsible for. So he's been doing his best to take care of this group of misfits and find them work and steer them in a little bit better of a little bit more lawful direction. So that's basically Runan's backstory. He has a series of people who work under him, and they generally crest the line between law and unlawfulness. They very much operate on both sides of that line. And he fell in with the rest of the party after joining an experiment in the Mage District of the city to find out what the effects of long-term exposure to a simulated how do I describe this? Boy, a long-term exposure to a simulated fantasy environment, basically a place that can provide all of your needs and things like that. There's an artifact in the Dungeon Master's book where you can basically enter into like this fantasy paradise world, and there was a mage who was running a study on the effects of long-term, like being in one of those long-term, and that's how the party met each other. They were all injected into this thing. They all had signed up for it, and then the campaign began with that as the main plot point. Moving on to our next character. Our next character is played by my friend Tom. Now, Tom, when he made his character, he wasn't really thinking about an extensive backstory. Dan did a really good job with his, and I really liked it a lot. And that's not to take anything away from Tom, because his character, he builds the flavor of his characters as he plays, as opposed to creating elaborate backstories that inform the character. He really likes to make his characters come alive and develop their personalities as he plays them. He's playing a dwarf fighter named Rubius Loomis, and he's a neutral good character generally, although he has had a few mishaps. He was a military dwarf, part of a unit of scouts, or a skirmish squad rather, and he didn't have a ton of experience, a ton of combat experience, but he ended up getting into a few skirmishes with some local barbarian tribes, and one of those skirmishes involved an orc druid calling down like a huge lightning strike at an area, and Rubeus was standing next to two of his fellow squad mates, one of which he didn't like a whole lot, and the other one he was kind of friends with. So he dove on his friend that he liked, leaving the other guy in his squad to suffer the full blast of the lightning bolt, and that character was a dwarf named Finbar, and he was basically crippled from that point on, and he harbored a lot of resentments towards Rubeus for that. And after his time was up of his, basically first tour of duty, if you will, Rubeus decided to resign from the military, which is kind of a big no-no for dwarves. They're pretty big into, military service or serving on ships, because their people come from a different continent and they're like a seafaring people. But he left the military service after that, and he bounced around a lot. He couldn't really figure out what it was that he wanted to do, but he did feel at home on the water, so he bought himself a little fishing boat with the leftover savings he had from his military service, and he kind of started up his own little, basically a food cart business. He would go out on the Inkfish Sea, which is the sea that the large capital city of Solara resides next to, and he would fish up a bunch of fish and then take them back to the city and prepare them and cook these elaborate fish meals, and he's like a pretty good cook. And he started this cart business, and then he saw a way to open, his dream is to open a restaurant and instead of just having a food cart. And he saw this experiment which was paying out 5,000 gold to all of the people who volunteered, and that's 5,000 gold each to all of the people who volunteered for this experiment in the Mage Quarter, and he saw that as a way to get enough gold to open his own restaurant. And that is basically the backstory of Rubeus. Moving on to our third character from the very beginning, my friend Mark, who's playing the character Aragrax Dardendrian. He was a Dragonborn, but through a series of reincarnations and resurrections, he is now a 13-year-old human boy. He was a Dragonborn wild magic sorcerer. He is now a human wild magic sorcerer. He, too, has a military background, but his backstory is a little bit more in-depth than Rubeus's. Aragrax was part of a scout squad in the military of the city, and he has the commander of his squad became a really close friend of his, and his name was Ludin, and he spent a lot of time teaching Grax, which is the shorthand version of Aragrax's name, Grax, teaching him a lot about the trade and military service and how to use his head instead of his fists to solve problems and things like that. But when they were out on patrol, they too got into it with some local barbarians, and because of the nature of his wild magic, when it first made itself apparent, he rolled on the table, basically. There's a table in the player's guide for wild magic sorcerers, and a necrotic blast exploded out from him during a thunderclap, and he killed a bunch of his own squad mates. And he took all of their dog tags, and air quotes dog tags, they're like sigils of membership for the squad, and he carries them around with him to remind himself. When he went back to the city by himself and told his commander what happened, this commander said, I can't do a whole lot to protect you from this, that they're going to have to do an inquiry and stuff like that, and you're going to be basically put on leave indefinitely. One of the members of his squad that wasn't killed, that wasn't there, is a rival soldier, basically, named Gordon Oleran, who is related to the Rhys Oleran in Runan's backstory. They are both from the same noble family of elves, and he is basically a giant racist asshole. He wants to remove Grax from the troop. He doesn't believe that at the time he was a Dragonborn, he doesn't believe that his Dragonborn nature serves itself well to the military. He thinks elves are like superior in every way, and generally he's like a giant petty dick who tries to get Grax kicked out of the military for a variety of reasons, and so when he heard about this thing happen, he put the wheels in motion with his connections he purchased his commission in the squad because he's a nobleman, and he did as much as elvenly possible to get Grax kicked out of the group, which is one of the reasons he was put on an indefinite leave. And throughout the course of the campaign, it's been kind of a running gag. Mark rolled pretty low on all of his stats, and so his character dies pretty frequently. Originally, I had a lot of divine magic. There's actually an entire religious quarter in the city. It's expensive, but they would constantly have to resurrect Grax because he would die so frequently. But eventually, his wild magic started making him reincarnate, and he came back as a tiefling. Now he's a human, and it's just, oh my goodness. Very much a fluid environment when Grax is involved. But that's his backstory, and now I will tell you a little bit about the fourth character. He's being played by my friend Sam. He was playing a different character. He was here for the original start of the campaign, but his character died about 12 sessions in, and then because of real life stuff, he couldn't be a consistent part of the campaign, so he stepped away for a while, and I was just DMing for my three friends, Tom, Mark, and Dan, and then Sam found some time, and he's recently come back to the campaign, and he's been playing an NPC that I had created named Cornelius Unithad, who is a wizard. He's pretty capable, he's likable, and he's smart, but he's also a necromancer. He's not a necromancer in the nefarious sort of way. He's mostly one of those guys who just kind of sees necromancy as a tool to achieve good ends. He doesn't see what the big deal is, really, but he does understand that it's taboo. And so he tries to keep it a secret. His familiar is a skeleton squirrel, and he only really pulls it out when nobody's watching. But recently, everybody's kind of got the spotlight on him, and they're like, oh, this guy does some weird stuff, but he's also a good guy, and he seems like he's on our side, so maybe we will just accept him and let him be part of our little party. Cornelius's backstory is basically what I told you already. He is a necromancer who studied under another wizard instead of in a wizarding school, and that wizard taught him a little bit of what he knew, but once Cornelius started to look into necromancy as a potential tool, that wizard was like, no, I'm not going to teach you anymore because that's kind of a taboo school of magic. And it's not outlawed or anything like that in the city. I mean, if you're walking around with corpses and stuff, you will definitely get arrested and all of that jazz. And there's like a council of wizards, basically a malpractice council, who deals with that kind of stuff. But he mostly tries to keep his necromantic spellcasting to himself. And that is essentially our four characters, our most stable roster. And next up, I will be doing a campaign, our session 33 campaign diary episode. And I wanted to make sure everybody had a little bit of background on what was going on, because if you didn't know the characters, you would have no idea what's going on, and it would make no sense to you. So, with that information, thank you for taking the time and spending the time here and listening to this. I appreciate each and every one of you. You guys are awesome, and have a good day, and don't be a dick.